I come to the floor today to shed light on yet another really dark cloud that's hanging over our Department of Defense. In fact, for decades, a dark cloud of fiscal mismanagement has loomed large over the Pentagon. During my very first term here in the United States Senate, I began my quest to bring fiscal accountability to the Pentagon. 4 decades later, I'm still keeping tabs on the money trail. That money trail is sometimes difficult to follow. Back then, it was a bit like David taking on Goliath. Now, we all know that the United States of America has the strongest and mightiest military in the world. And I'm thankful for that, because a strong military is not meant to fight a war. It's meant to maintain the peace. And we haven't had a World War III since we've had a strong military. Our brave men and women who serve in the U.S. Armed Forces protect our shores at home and abroad, to keep us safe and to protect the blessings of liberty for our children and grandchildren. That's exactly why it's so very important to keep check on the Pentagon's ledgers, to help make sure that every tax dollar assigned to the nation's defense is actually spent effectively and not squandered on waste, fraud, and abuse. With the help of brave whistleblowers who stuck their necks out to commit truth, I stuck my neck out during the Reagan administration. That's when I learned about the Pentagon's little shop of price horrors. Of course, ripping off the taxpayers started in the Revolutionary War, when contractors sold rotten meat to the Continental Army. And it continued during the Civil War, when profiteers sold ammunition filled with sawdust and shoddy shoes and horses to the Union Army. And it looks like it continues to this day. Back in 1985, Americans will recall the Defense Department was shelling out vast amounts of taxpayer dollars for spare parts. Remember back then the $450 hammers and the $640 toilet seats. That sounds like a real bargain compared to the more recent wasteful spending at the Pentagon, such as the $1,280 coffee mug and the $14,000 toilet seat lid. Obviously, the cost of waste is getting a whole lot more expensive for our taxpayers. Back in the 1980s then, I fought to win a spending freeze on unchecked spending sprees. Misspending and overspending were riddling the defense budget at the expense of the American taxpayer. Military readiness drives the spending decisions that members of Congress make when we cast our votes on that defense budget. Our constituents expect their elected representatives to make sure that the moms and dads, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters who are serving our country in uniform are well equipped with the best resources that money can buy. But they also expect us elected representatives to make sure that the hard-earned dollars that's withheld from every paycheck, their tax dollars, aren't being ripped off by greedy corporations like the TransDigm Group, Inc., which I will speak about in a moment. That's why I conduct robust oversight of defense spending. as a taxpayer's watchdog, and all of us are supposed to be watchdogs, and all of us would claim to be watchdogs, it's our responsibility and my responsibility to make sure that every defense dollar is spent as effectively and efficiently as possible. Because every dollar lost to waste, fraud, and abuse harms military readiness, and it also lines the pockets of somebody else at taxpayers' expense. Trimming the fat in a bloated bureaucracy won't happen in the shadows. There's no magic wand to wave, on the other hand. And if there's one thing I've learned in my years of oversight, transparency matters. Transparency brings accountability. Every time I come to the floor to talk about the fiscal mess at the Pentagon, I get a bit of deja vu. Earlier I said my fraud-fighting efforts in the mid-1980s could be compared to David versus Goliath. Now let's fast forward to this year, 2019. I'm still here working as hard as ever to do away with the wrongdoing and the extract fiscal accountability at the Pentagon. Today, some might say that that job is like the one performed by the famous character in Greek mythology who was destined to roll that heavy stone up the hill and to do it from then until eternity. Congressional oversight can be extremely tedious and it can be time-consuming. But as I like to remind each of the other 534 members of Congress, it's essential to our country that we exercise this system of checks and balances. Without it, the dark fiscal cloud looming over the Pentagon would swell bigger and bigger and bigger. Oversight work may feel like an uphill climb, but oversight is not futile in the end. And that's why I keep my shoulder to the wheel, to hold people at the Pentagon accountable, to protect taxpayers, and most importantly, when it comes to a defense dollar, to make sure that we have our military readiness. So right now, I'm here today to share some new details about the broken record of fiscal mismanagement at the Department of Defense. No matter how high I turn up the volume, the overdogs at the Pentagon remain tone deaf to fiscal integrity. Consider the recent report by the Department of Defense's Office of Inspector General. It's called, quote, Review of Parts Purchased from TransDigm Group, Inc., end of quote. First, I ought to compliment Senator Warren and two representatives, Ro Khanna and Tim Ryan, for getting the ball rolling with their request asking the Inspector General to look into this contractor's pricing structure. We need all hands on deck in Congress to conduct oversight. So I thank these other members of Congress just named. After digging into the details, I can only conclude that the Pentagon is still, after all these years, stuck on autopilot. No one on board in the Pentagon's mothership seems to bother to steer its fiscal ship into shape. Fiscal integrity somehow got lost in the spare parts horror story that I'm about to tell. In fact, I was more than dismayed with the response from the internal watchdogs at the DOD IG office. Their team wrote the report, and yet the Inspector General leadership team seemed to show no urgency whatsoever to fix the problem that they described. This tells me I also need to keep a tight leash on the internal watchdogs leading the Department of Defense's Inspector General's office. Their February report exposes a galactic price gouging, colossal ripoff, and out-of-this-world waste. It reads like a sequel to the same financial shenanigans that have turned the Pentagon into a taxpayer money pit. Change out the name of the contractor, inflate the charges, submit the invoice, and voila! The American taxpayer is on the hook for another fixed price, sole source contract. For this report, the Inspector General examined one contractor, TransDigm Group. In total, the Inspector General analyzed 113 contracts between January 2015 and January 2017. It reviewed 47 spare parts the Department of Defense purchased from this contractor. In just those 2 years, the Inspector General found TransDigm overcharged the Pentagon by $16.1 million out of a total of $29.7 million in contracts. The reasonable profit threshold is considered by the Department of Defense to be 15% or below. The IG found that TransGem earned excess profits of 46 of the 47 parts sold to the Defense Department. On 17 of those parts, TransDigm earned more than a 1,000% profit. Remarkably, the highest profit percentage was 4,436%. Now, it's obvious to our taxpayers that that is a fleecing of the American taxpayer, pulling the wool over the eyes of Congress and the taxpayers will only stop with transparency, which transparency will bring accountability. So that's why I'm here today. Just think for a minute about the big picture. This report is just one snapshot of a much larger problem. It's kind of a spit in the ocean when you consider the enormous $716 billion defense budget. Just imagine the boatloads of bloat elsewhere in the bureaucracy. The Department of Defense is obligated under federal law and under regulations to uphold basic measures of fiscal integrity. So where do we go from here? The Inspector General made just a few paltry recommendations. For starters, it directed contracting officers to request voluntary refunds for excess profits. Guess the chances of getting voluntary refunds. Let me suggest that I wouldn't advise taxpayers to hold their breath on a voluntary refund. The Inspector General's recommendations then have no teeth. Their recommendations are insufficient. And what's worse, the Inspector General leadership team claims no single Department of Defense official is responsible for this price gouging that goes on. So let me repeat. The Inspector General leadership team the internal watchdog for fiscal integrity and compliance at the Department of Defense, is effectively saying something like this: no one person at the Department of Defense can be held accountable for waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayers' money. Obviously, to the taxpayers listening, or anybody else, this illustrates a cavalier attitude towards taxpayers' money that former Secretary of Defense James Mattis sought to extinguish. And by the way, I wrote him a note complimenting him on some statements he made about taking care of some of these problems. The decades-long odyssey of misspending at the Pentagon keeps going around and around and around. That's why, the way I see it, the Department of Defense has a fundamental responsibility to uphold fiscal integrity. And after reviewing the IG report and meeting with its auditing team and the Department of Defense pricing czar, I have reached three conclusions. Number one, fiscal control at the Department of Defense are AWOL. The Pentagon will never clean up its books if it can't properly track the money trail and connect the dots. Consider why the Department of Defense contracting officers were unable to even certify if a profit was, quote unquote, fair and reasonable. You know why? It was because they could not obtain critical cost data at the company TransDigm. And in the most egregious case, that case that I mentioned where there was a 4,436% profit margin for just one spare part, the contracting officer, you won't believe this, certified that the price was fair and reasonable. There is something very, very wrong about that procedure. A whopping 4,000% profit margin for a spare part doesn't square with our Midwestern common sense standard. Number two, the leadership team at the Inspector General has exhibited an alarming hands-off approach towards stopping waste, fraud, and abuse. The lack of urgency and the failure to hold anyone accountable is very revealing. You know, it sends a signal throughout the chain of command. Just keep on signing contracts. Keep ordering spare parts. Keep up business as usual. And lastly, it shows that no one will be held accountable for price gouging. Number three, the pattern of price gouging at TransDigm and its subsidiaries has gone unimpeded for decades. It has amassed exclusive rights to sell these spare parts to the Pentagon. In fact, the Defense Department accounted for 34% of its sales in 2017. TransDigm exploited its business model and took advantage of its sole source position to leverage higher prices. Now, as a former chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and still a member of that committee, I have examined anti-competitive business practices over a long period of time, including those in agriculture and the pharmaceutical sectors of our economy. It's very concerning to me when contracting arrangements like those between TransDigm and its 100 subsidiaries are effectively a monopoly. It's like an octopus with 100 arms putting the squeeze on the Pentagon. Effectively, the Pentagon is at the mercy of TransDigm, who owns the intellectual property to buy the spare parts it needs to build the nation's critical weapon systems. That leaves the American taxpayer on the hook for exorbitant price gouging. The Inspector General report found that TransDigm chokehold has added up to tens of millions of dollars overcharging to the taxpayer. This is a good time to refresh people's memories about my legislative and oversight work with anti-competitive business practices. Pretty simple. Monopolies invite government regulation. If that's the road TransDigm wants to continue following, I'm here to deliver a message. The jig is up on this cozy relationship. The buck stops here. I've written a letter to Acting Secretary of Shanahan about these flawed contracts and failures to identify price gouging. I've asked him to make measurable recommendations on how to restore accountability and end this price gouging. One thing is crystal clear. Transparency and competition are MIA, missing in action, when the Pentagon buys spare parts from TransDigm and its subsidiaries. Now, thank God, the other body, the House of Representatives, its Committee on Oversight and Reform, called an oversight hearing this week to examine TransDigm and its price gouging shenanigans. Congress has a constitutional duty of oversight to keep check on taxpayers' money and hold government accountable. As I said earlier, we need all hands on deck to root out wasteful spending. Once again, we're back to square one. The Pentagon has flunked a fundamental benchmark of fiscal responsibility and stewardship. It's one of Washington's worst-kept secrets. Year after year, Congress shovels more money into the Pentagon coffers to ensure we maintain the best military in the world. And I express my support for the military. I express my support that a strong Department of National Defense is also a strong keeper of the peace, because we might not be challenged and we're going to be able to help peace around the world. But year after year, the Pentagon squanders hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. Some people at the Pentagon seem to think that paying $16 million in excess profits somehow seems to be small potatoes. In my letter to the Acting Defense Secretary, I made it clear that I'm not one of those people. I've asked him to answer a direct question. That question is this: what specific steps is he going to take to stop the profiteers from pilfering taxpayers' money? Contracts, like I've described today, between TransDigm and the Pentagon are shortchanging the troops, fleecing the taxpayers, and tarnishing its reputation. As Justice Brandeis said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And so I'm here today to pull back the curtains on TransDigm's audit. The American people need the sun to shine in on price gouging at the Pentagon so we can root out the wasteful spending here and elsewhere. Transparency is the best ammunition that we have to chase away the dark fiscal cloud looming along the shores of the Potomac.